I want to welcome everybody to the study group for week 11. And as always, we're going to kind of open with kind of what questions do you have of the current material before we kind of dive into new stuff? Any questions?
Quiz review.
Quiz review. Okay. Was there a specific aspect of the quiz that you want review on, or were there certain questions that that you struggled with?
I need to pull it back up. So
Okay, no worries. That's what I'm pulling it back up right now as well. Looks like on average, folks did fairly well. Let's see.
What is fairly well?
I don't know that anybody failed it. And we're right about where averages should be. So, like, as far as a bell curve goes. So,
what was like the average then?
like 87.
Okay.
So, about where it should be.
So, is the final grade on the bell curve?
Oh, are you asking? Is the final grade curved? No.
Yep. Okay.
What I mean by on a normal curve is that the distributions were about normal, meaning that the average is right about where I would expect it, with an equal number kind of above and below that within a standard ratio, with maybe one or two kind of outliers. So if you think about 87 as the midway point, going up or down 13 points, most people fall within that range. So most people fall between like 100% and a 74. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then there may be one or two outliers. So, yeah. So what questions do we have on the quiz specifically? Like, is it just endings? Is it now? What I will say is this: I have not went through and hand graded the translations from this chapter yet. And the consequence of that, well, no, hold on. I guess they were dropped down and used. Never mind. I take that back. I thought they were fill in the blank, but so you were saying, sorry.
There was one.
Go ahead, Leno. I think we're having maybe a connection issue because you are breaking up on me. And now I just hear silence. Brandon, what did you say?
The translation is kicking my butt. I'm having what it is. I thought for sure I had it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I knew the tense. I knew. I mean, I obviously knew the moods, and I feel like I had a good feel for it. And I still got it wrong, and so it. I don't know. I mean, it was just, and it stung this time because it was weighted heavier than the one translation question was weighted with 10 points or whatever it was, and so it was a little bit. So I'm just having a hard time with that for some reason. I can't figure out quite what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, and I need to maybe review this particular question, because you're right, it is weighed really heavily, and it's not granting partial credit. And normally I don't like, I don't like questions like that.
Which one was that?
Question number 9.
The translation?
Yeah, the translation.
Yeah, I got cut off. I'm sorry. That was the question that I had before I was disconnected.
Yeah, and I'm looking at that right now, and the fact that it's not granting partial credit, for some reason I guess I thought it was. I'll sit down and review that because I'm not content when they're not granting significant partial credit on that. So
is there any way that you could put that question on the screen somehow?
I mean, that's what not really.
Okay.
Because
kind of walk me through it a little bit.
Yeah. So let me
because I can't even remember what it was.
Yep. Let me pull up a. Let me pull that up real quick. Okay. I'll pull it up on a Word document. How's that sound? And we can work through it on that.
Okay.
Because otherwise it's trying to make me pull it up on somebody's quiz. And I don't want to do that. That's not cool.
Okay. Well, you could pull it up on my quiz. I wouldn't care if everybody knew what I got.
Hold on, let's adjust that. Okay. So what I've done is I've just copy pasted this in a Word document.
Okay.
Let me point out to you all that you are more than welcome to use a Word document like this in the quiz. And so, this is like using a scrap piece of paper, basically. Okay. And so what this would allow you to potentially do is to mark up the passage as you're working through it.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know what kind of markup method you want to use, but let's kind of work through this together. How's that sound? And so I'll use, I can't use my normal one because I can't draw on this, but I'll use a different kind of highlighting one so that we can work through it. How's that sound?
Okay.
So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for conjunctions, right? That's the first step.
Yep.
Okay. We have a de here at the beginning.
Right.
So let me block that out in teal. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look for our, we don't really have any punctuation of significance. So we're going to look next for our verbs. And what verbs do we see?
So verbs would be, well, you've got edate.
Yeah, the udate.
Or udate.
Yep.
And then
we have one more.
Is it the first word? Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Word.
Which means I will. Is that right?
Yeah. So let's look at it. So what is this coming from? What verb? So let's ask this. Where's the ending?
Yeah. So the ending. Yeah. So the ending I can identify.
Is what?
So the ending is the amen.
It is maybe kind of.
Okay.
So we're going to draw a line there. Okay. But what I want to point out is, well, we have that amen, and then what else has been added to the stem?
It's got the epsilon at the beginning.
Yes. So we have this epsilon here at the beginning. So let's draw a line there as well. And so what is the stem of this verb?
So the stem
doesn't look
be,
like pempso. Pempso does not look like anything that we know.
Yeah. So it'd be pempsa, and the men would be the.
Yeah. So what we're actually looking at is underneath this C. see if I can.
Okay.
Underneath that C is actually P and that's what's hiding underneath that C. Remember what we remember last week when we talked about how when that sigma comes crashing in, it's going to combine with certain things and turn them into sibilants?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that C is one of those sibilants. And so hiding underneath that C is a P and a sigma.
Okay.
So what this should tell us is that the first thing that this should tell us is that the ending with the tense indicator that we're looking at is actually Samen. You see that?
Okay. Makes sense.
And that actually, and so then the rest of this should clarify itself, because now PEMP is the stem that we're dealing with. Because ignore basically that C, and you see that PEMP.
Yep.
And do we know a verb that has a root that is PEMP?
Tempo.
Tempo, indeed. And so now we have a epsilon historical augment. By seeing that epsilon historical augment, we know we're either in the imperfect or in the aorist.
Right.
And so then we jump to here to see if we have that SA tense indicator. We do, which means that we're in the aorist. And then we have this ending of men, which tells us that the end is actually a first person plural. Do we see that?
I see that. Yep.
Okay. So we're going to translate this something like we sent. Because it's a past tense, finite action, simple past. So we sent.
Okay.
Is everybody following that? So that's where we're going to start. Down here, Udita is what? Well, we'll get to that. So let's.
Sorry, you broke up.
I'm sorry.
Broke up there for a second.
Yeah, let's finish marking this up, because I'm jumping ahead even by working through that verb. So let's finish marking it up. So we actually have something that's modifying a verb here, or well, maybe. What is this who? Let me ask that.
Be like a no or a not.
I'm misleading you by asking that question. I'm going to be very, very upfront. Take a look at that again. Is that the negation?
It's
anybody else is welcome to pipe in. I don't want to just keep putting Brandon on the spot.
Doesn't it mean like whose or whom? Or
yeah, exactly. So
clearly
it's a
I need to work
relative
on my charts a little bit, but
no worries. Yeah, it's a relative pronoun. And so remember the relative looks a lot like the negation. And that's actually what we're seeing here, is we're seeing a relative pronoun. And so remember, with relatives, as soon as we see a relative, we need to bracket it out, because it's going to create a subordinate clause. So now we will need to figure out, let me say this, where this subordinate clause ends. It started here. We need to figure out where it ends. But before we do that, let me just point something out. Before we start identifying objects and stuff like that, one thing that I find helpful when we move into the object phase, because there's no nominatives here. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. Like, we have 0 nominatives. I will often go through and mark the front of each prepositional phrase. Okay? And then what I try to do is then figure out where those prepositional phrases close, because that'll very quickly isolate what we still need to identify. So let's start from the beginning. Where's the first prepositional phrase that you all see?
The met, which is meta.
Yes. Yes, met, which is meta.
Yeah.
In what case does met take? Or meta? Do we remember?
Takes accusative or genitive.
It takes an accusative, or a genitive. And what are the different possible options with an accusative or a genitive? Let me ask that. I'll go with that.
Direct object in possession.
Well, so those are what the genitive and accusative cases do. But remember, they're only that case with a prepositional phrase. With this, so meta specifically, with a genitive, you translate it how?
With.
With, and an accusative, you translate it how?
After, behind?
Yes, after or behind. Exactly. So now you actually have a really interesting challenge here. Okay. Normally, and this is actually what you're going to do is you're going to look at the word immediately after this to figure out what met is, like what's in the prepositional phrase. You have a genitive. You can normally, what I would do is just drop a parens here. I would say, and this is what you need to be careful of, it's not this way in this case. So like, let me allay fears here. But sometimes you have a discontinuous element. Like, remember how genitive modifiers can sit anywhere? Like, but normally they're sitting after the thing they modify. But normally they're near the thing they modify. What I would be nervous about would be that this genitive modifier actually goes to this word, and that met is actually conjoined or part of this. This is actually part of that phrase. Does that make sense? And that's not the case here. So let me be very clear. But that would be something that would be a potential here if I were translating and I bumped into this. Is I would check the translations with it taking this accusative, like this accusative, the brother of him, or taking just this and then treating this. Is this an accusative, right?
Yes.
So as an accusative, it's either the direct object of the verb, which is pempo, or it's part of that prepositional phrase. So this is actually a tricky. This is somewhat tricky because where to drop this parens, either back here and saying that this is a discontinuous element that's been fronted in this prepositional phrase. It's actually a lot less likely than the fact that this meta just goes with of two, which in this case it does. That's the more straightforward answer. The more straightforward and simple possibility is indeed the answer here. And so when you close that, then that means that this tone adelphone needs to actually, that's probably a true accusative, which means that we need to mark it as the direct object. Okay. So then we have this beginning of this subordinate clause. We don't know where this subordinate clause ends, so we're not going to mess with it right now. But what we do see is we bump up against another prepositional phrase. N. You see that? So now, where do we want to close this prepositional phrase? What case does N take?
Yeah.
Dative. Do we have a dative that follows it? Is this a dative?
Toe is dative, yeah.
Yes, it is indeed dative. Now, so do you think we should drop the parentheses, the prepositional phrase here, in between these two?
Yeah is I mean, it's going to be according to, so I mean,
what part of speech is dia?
well, it's either going to, part like in the sense of accusative or genitive?
No, not case.
Not
Like what
case.
part, like, is it a noun? Is it a conjunction? What is dia?
Is it a preposition?
It is. So dia is another preposition. So that's actually a flag or a signal that the break has to be here between those two phrases, because you can't have a preposition inside another preposition. Remember, prepositions take a noun and then you close the parentheses. Okay? And they like a noun in there may have like a genitive modifier or something, but you'll never have a prepositional phrase inside of another prepositional phrase. And so when you bump up against this other preposition, you need to close that parentheses, because it immediately, because once another one starts, this one has to end. Which again, this prepositional phrase is fairly straightforward. So we jump back here with dia, and what case does dia take?
Accusative genitive.
Do we have an accusative or a genitive that follows it?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a genitive.
Yep. And we have genitives all the way across. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll need to close that parentheses, because all of this is part of that prepositional phrase. Here's your noun, and this is an adjectival modifier, basically. Modifying that. Okay. So now that we've done that, the only question we haven't answered is where do we close this bracket for this subordinate clause? Okay. Now, one of the challenges here is that, well, this subordinate clause, this bracket explains why we have a second verb in this sentence. Is because that second verb is within the subordinate clause, because the clause needs its own verb. And so you could possibly close it here, potentially close it here, or potentially close it all the way at the end. And so what we'll have to do is, as we translate, we're going to have to kind of figure out where it fits best. I'm going to close it here for right now, but we're going to need to potentially revisit that as we make some progress on the translation. Okay?
Okay.
So let's go back to the beginning. Technically, this dash should be something like moreover or however. Ironically, it's not translated at all in the correct answer. That's not to say that the correct answer is wrong, but normally you would expect some type of translation there for that conjunction. So moreover or whatever or however or but or just sometimes nothing. We sent. And how do we want to translate this prepositional phrase? Meta with a genitive.
So it's going to be with.
Of two?
Yeah, with M.
Well, this is a singular. That omicron upsilon ending is the singular genitive. So with him?
With him, yeah.
We sent with him. And who did we send with him? Ton Adelphone?
The brothers.
The brothers is that own ending a plural or a singular?
The own ending is singular.
So we sent with him the brother. And this relative is gonna the relatives are modifying basically what immediately precedes it. So it's gonna tell us like a who or whom. So it's gonna tell us some information about that brother. We sent with him the brother who or whose let's just translate this straight. What's this word tain agapein?
So aga So agape. I'm drawing a blank right now.
Agape. This is an acute the ane ending is what case? Well, more importantly,
so it's accusative.
It is. Like agape.
So agape would be love.
Whose love? And udite. Our new verb.
Yeah,
Second
udite.
person.
Yeah, it's
I mean, to know, to understand.
Yeah.
I feel like if you struggle with the vocab, just guess to know or understand, because that was the answer for like 4 of the words.
To know or understand.
Yeah, I don't understand why there were so many. Like, I understand there are many words that mean to understand.
Yeah, that's funny. So we sent with him the brother whose love, and then you know. So that's that bracket. Okay, that subordinate clause. And then what's this prepositional phrase?
In the good news.
In the good news or in the gospel?
In the gospel, yeah.
In the gospel. And then let's go to this other prepositional phrase. Dia with a genitive is what?
Dia with a genitive is because or through.
Through. It's through. Pason is all. And then all what? Ton ecclesione.
The assembly.
Of the churches.
Assemblies.
So the correct translation should look something like this. Moreover, we sent with him the brother whose love you know in the gospel through all the churches.
Which is really not really a sentence, right?
I mean, it is.
I guess it is. It's just worded so weird that I thought I couldn't find the subject.
It's baked into the verb. It's baked into the verb. Remember, you will not always have an explicit subject.
Yeah, that's why it just sounded like not a complete sentence.
Yep. If you do not have an explicit subject, remember that the subject may be it may be implied in the verb itself. So go ahead.
So we've been looking at this for about 25 minutes, and I know you're explaining it to us.
Yep.
But on the quiz, I mean, obviously, you have your nerves and you're trying to get through all of the questions.
Yep.
It just seemed like a long time to try to break this down.
Well, the good news is this. Because it's a drop-down menu, you're able to look to do the drop-down and look and see at the different arrangements and to kind of translate through and to see where it breaks down. And so it's less of having to do this from memory, and more being able to select the correct option from multiple options. Now that said, I think I'm not content with how this is all or nothing grade wise.
But this is one of the ones that a lot of the options. There was one that you could kind of kick out fairly easy, but. Yep. 2 or 3 of them, they seem to be very, very close this time around.
Yeah, and sometimes they're going to be a little bit more difficult, and I think that this is one of them. So
I can't see the other options now, but I think I remember that this was the only option where it said we sent with him, and I just knew that was. I thought that's what that beginning of the sentence was. And I think that's why I ended up going with it, because it was the only one that had those words, even though it didn't sound like a sentence to me.
So one started with we sent with his brother.
His brother. Oh yeah.
Yep. And then one was you sent with us.
Yeah.
Which obviously was not. the correct, and the other one was we will send with him. So technically, you only needed to translate the first 3 words to get the right answer. Because if you got this far, that actually distinguished between the 4 options or so.
Yeah, I chose the we sent with his brother one. Was the one that was the one that got me.
Yeah, and so what that means is that when you looked at this, what you did was what I warned you about, which is you treated this prepositional phrase as being fully within here. Okay. And then what that would have meant is that, let me underline that, that this, you are treating this genitive as actually modifying that. So we sent, and so here's the irony of this. What does meta plus the accusative mean?
It was with? No.
Well, no. So the genitive is with. If it's the accusative, it's after or behind. Okay.
Oh,
so if you would have taken that, you would have had to translate this. We sent after his brother or behind his brother. You could not have translated this as with, because this has to take the genitive, which means you would have had to have closed that here. And thus this had to be treated as a direct object to this verb.
Yeah. That must have been it. That must have been what I was thinking.
So, which is it's a pretty, like, as I said, it's a possibility, but it's a pretty easy mistake. Like, so if you're just doing the drop-down menu, you're doing the first couple words. Again, if you get that first word, the verb parsed as a, if you get that first verb parsed, let me point this out, that eliminates 2 of the options. Because one of those options is we will send, which this is not a future, so that's out. And the other is you sent, which is also not an option because this is a first plural.
And that I got, and that's why I chose the answer. I was like, I because of that epsilon coupling at the beginning, as far as I knew it was present tense, something was doing and going. Yeah.
So that this first word knocks out 2 of your 4 options. And then you basically, how you treat this will knock out the other one.
Aha. Okay.
So I hope that, I know that probably doesn't solve anything, Linnell. But what I would say is that you could have hopefully eliminated it just by beginning the translation for those possibilities. That's the kind of the intent with that question.
Okay.
Did we have any other questions? Oh, I will say this: we don't have for translations, like you guys all didn't. You didn't have a lot of translations on your midterm, and we will have a couple on our final, but there will not be a lot. Let me affirm that. Like the kind of the pacing and the approach that you guys have been doing, it will not be a lot different when you get to your final. So it's not like you're going to get to your final and it's all translation. Like, that's not what this is going to be. It will be very much in the shape of the quizzes and things you've done previously. So let me hopefully encourage you all. But I will agree that this was a little bit difficult. Especially if you didn't, like in the beginning, you weren't immediately eliminating options and stuff like that. If you wanted to translate the whole thing and then you go back, I could definitely you could run out of time pretty easily.
And it's so, on my end, I'm just it's so frustrating in a sense, because I'm obviously, I just wish that I could give 20 more hours to this every single week. You know what I mean? And
it is a very time intensive, set of material.
It is. And it's just the pace, obviously I understand, but it's just so, it's you know what I mean? I want to know it, but it just seems like the amount of time that you've got to put in to get what you want. It's just, most people just don't have it, and so.
Yep. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Like, it is a there with this type of work. There's two things at work. One is that everybody learns the languages at a different speed. So there is some degree of natural aptitude. But the other half of it is that most of what it is just simply hours. It's can you pour 10 to 15 hours a week into just memorization and reading and drills. And that's, and there's just not a quick way around that type of work.
Right.
Other than just putting the time in. I don't know what else to say.
No, I agree. Yeah, and for me, the memorization is, I mean, I do it on my phone when I'm sitting waiting for meetings, and that's the easier part. The harder part is this translation where I need to be sitting down at the desk and really working and just taking the time to break all this down and really figuring it out.
And I would encourage you all, when you do your homework, to mark this up, like what I've kind of done here, or what I do when we practice on the exercises, of like underline and kind of work through it and box things off, because it'll help you preserve. Like, so when you get into the chaos of translating, especially when you're in a testing environment, you're stressed, you're firing on all cylinders and you're trying to like jump around and you make an observation, marking it up will help you preserve data and observations that you make in your translation. And what I mean by that is, like, as soon as you look at this passage right here, okay, and you see, I do it in a rigid order so I don't forget anything. This is not doing what I wanted to do. Ooh. Let me do this. This is fully marked up, so this isn't going to help. That's too bad. No. Okay. But like immediately when I look at something, I immediately like box off my conjunctions. I immediately, if I see a preposition, I put the first part of a bracket in front of every preposition. I immediately will highlight all my verbs. And so it gets faster the more you practice it, is what I would say. And it helps you preserve those observations for when you go back and like you jump back and are having to like work through, like, okay, what is my object? Well, it's not any of these other things that I've marked. And so that will help you kind of work through those types of things. And help you help you condense things into digestible, bite-sized pieces of information. Because one of the problems is when you hit a translation is just the possibility of just being overwhelmed by what you're looking at. That's a very real possibility. For me, I have anxiety problems. So I would get into this stuff and I would just freeze. And I just couldn't perform on tests. And so I had to develop a methodology in order to let me take stuff in bite-sized pieces so that I don't get overwhelmed by the possibilities. And so that I could help digest it. And so that's why I did that, was so that I like things that I knew that I could just immediately eliminate because they're not what I'm looking for. And that's where the value of sectioning off prepositional phrases and underlining verbs and all that is, that when I begin looking for my direct object, I don't want any of that in the way, and I know none of that's a possibility if I haven't marked off. And so it helps me eliminate down to 2 or 3 other words. And is it this one? No, because this is a genitive. Is this one? Yeah, that's an accusative. That's exactly what I need. That type of thing as I'm trying to put back the sentence back together. So I would highly encourage you all to, to do that. Now, especially because the testing is in a digital environment, you'll need to come up with a marking method that you feel confident with or comfortable with to do in a Word document. And that's why the way I used to practice all of my marking up was in a Word document. Now I'm so used to doing it by hand that I don't do it by using Word document anymore. But I used to, my regular methodology was blocking out, doing solid colors for some things, red for the verb, double, doing a single underline, double, single underline for the nominative, double underline for the accusative and stuff like that. For genitives, I would do a little arrow. Do something like this. for genitives to help point to what it's modifying, stuff like that. Because normally genitive modifiers are going to be next to the thing they modify. And just all of that you could do fairly quickly and will add up to helping you kind of divvy out what you're looking at. So is that helpful? Do you all find that helpful? Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Do you want to spend some time with the new material? Is that what you all would like to do next?
Yes.
Because we may, because this is what I'm about to tell you is probably the last thing that you want to hear, given the current conversation. So let me pull this up and we'll begin to kind of walk through some of this. There's going to be some memorization this week, and there's just not, normally I don't say like you just need to memorize, but that's what's going to need to happen this week. And there's just almost no way around it.
Can I ask a general question about?
Yes. Yeah.
So why are some verbs in all these different forms?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question.
I guess I understood the part about, I guess, is it only about how like we have came, went, and like the words really change? Is it just that they're just different, or are some verbs only second aorist and not also, you know?
So let me ask you this: in English, what is the if I say I'm going to I go to the store, you know, that communicates, it's like a present tense simple. If I want to say that in a simple past tense, how do I say that?
Yeah, I went, which is nothing like the word go.
Which is nothing like the word go. That's the perfect, and that's exactly what ericoma is, and that's the irony. The reason why it's weird is because words that are more common have a chance of mutating. So let me start there. Because the more common a word is in use, the more likely it is to go through alterations and change by regional dialects and stuff like that. So that's the first thing. The second, you'll find this across all linguistics. The things that are most common are often the things that have irregular forms. Like the verb to be, imi, is this weird kind of amalgamation thing that doesn't really follow all the rules that you'd expect it to. If you go to ser in Spanish, it's ser is weird in Spanish, like according to like the paradigms and stuff like that. It's not fully like regular is what I would say. And most other verbs that are like hyper common, there will often be irregularities in some languages. So you're going to find this across most languages, these kind of mutations. And it just has to do with the function of how often, like words that are more common have a larger chance of mutating, basically. That's one aspect. And then the other aspect is that as language evolves and develops, sometimes words that have overlapping semantic fields will, like, one form will be the more popular in the present tense and one form will be the more popular in the past tense. And then the alternate versions, like the complementary like past and present tenses fall out of use, and those two words will continue on. So for example, go and went is a perfect example of this. Like those are from two different stems. And if you went back to like Middle English, I think like the present tense of went maybe is wane. I'd have to go back and double check. But it's that type of thing where if you went back to Middle English, you'd be able to trace that usage in its different forms. But what ended up happening is that one of those forms fell out of usage and the semantic overlap was close enough with another verb that just became the present tense of that other verb.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And again, you'll find this in lots of different languages. And so it's like English is just one example of this, which let me as a side, you know, I know we need to move on, but let me just as an aside, let me point this out. When we talk about like, oh yeah, you know, we're talking about the biblical languages. And so like BDAG is looking at everything from like 200 BC to like 400 AD, all of our documents. That's a 600-year stretch. Go look at English 600 years ago, and let's talk about how those languages are similar and different. And the reality is that English was very different 600 years ago. And so languages can go through lots and lots of changes in a much shorter time, and English is a perfect example of this, than what we actually see in Greek. So Greek is actually remarkably stable for as long as it's in usage and as regular as it is. That's just a side note, but it's one of those pet peeves of mine that it's worth talking about. Okay. So that's the irregulars. Irregulars, they just are. So what we learned last week is that we have 4 tenses that we're working with currently: the present, future, imperfect, and aorist. The present and future have stems that are fairly stable. Occasionally, this future stem is going to change, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. But they're going to use the same set of basically endings. The only exception to this is the passive, the future passive, which we have not done yet. And there's a reason for that. But for the future, it just takes a sigma. Everything else is basically the same. For the imperfect and the aorist, excuse me, I apologize. The future and the aorist, the imperfect is going to be often very similar to the aorist, at least for this tense, this historical augment. But what we'll find out is that sometimes this aorist stem is going to change. When it does not change, you're often going to have the sigma alpha, the sigma with the alpha and epsilon connecting vowels, and then those secondary endings. Okay, so that's what we did last week. That's just a brief review of just talking through kind of what we learned last week. So what we need to know is that for the aorist, there are basically 2 groupings of verbs. The first grouping is essentially a majority of all verbs. Okay, 9 out of 10 verbs fall into this, like what we call a first aorist verb, and that's just simply they become an aorist exactly how we learned last week, and that means that it'll take a sa, a sigma with an alpha or epsilon connecting vowel, and then it'll use those type 2, type 4 endings with a historical augment on the front. So there's another group of verbs that are called second aorist verbs. Now let me be very clear about this. All of this is the aorist tense. This is not an issue of translation. They all translate identically, okay? It's just that some verbs are weird, and when they're in the aorist, they look weird, and they don't look like how the other verbs normally look in the aorist. This is a characteristic of the verb, not of, like, and what I mean by that is, like, a certain verb will be a second aorist verb. Erkoma is an example of this. Erkoma is a second aorist verb, which means in the aorist tense, the stem changes. The stem goes weird, functionally, is the best way to say it. When this happens, what's going to happen is that sigma alpha indicator and connecting vowel that we've come to expect in the aorist, as of last week, what's going to happen is instead of that, what we'll do is we'll get something that looks basically identical to the imperfect, except there's been a stem change. And so the stem itself has changed. As a side note, verbs that are weird in the aorist, these second aorist verbs, will often be unusual in the other tenses where there are changes. So for example, if you have something that's a second aorist verb, oftentimes it's the second aorist verbs that they themselves be they may or may not have a stem change in the future. Remember I said rarely you'll see it in the future, regularly in the aorist. And so it's the future changes are a subcategory of those second aorist verbs. This again is not unlike English's awake or awoke, wake or awoke, take or took, go or went, that type of thing. These are changes that we're all familiar with in English, and they are also there. They're also present in Greek. Now, they're most often going to use an omicron epsilon connecting vowel. Notice I say most often. That's not going to be fully reliable. And sometimes that first aorist that sa will even show up. Now, let me just say this is a good thing, because the problem with second aorist is that they hide the fact that they're aorist. Okay, so if that sa shows up, if that alpha epsilon shows up, that's actually a good thing, because that tells you are definitely in the aorist. Because otherwise, you may mistake it for an imperfect, and that's the challenge. So anything to help you identify it as an aorist is a good thing. So when this irregularity is actually a good thing for second aorist verbs, not a bad thing. The primary indicator for a second aorist is going to be the stem change. oftentimes it will look, if you don't know that the stem change has happened, it's just going to look like an imperfect. And you're going to parse it like an imperfect, and you'll get it wrong. You'll translate it like an imperfect, and it's just simply not an imperfect. So you have to know when a stem change has occurred. It's the only way to know with these second aorists. Now, the stem changes must be memorized. And this is a chart we're going to get to here in a minute. There's just not a good way around this. I've highlighted the stem changes that you like absolutely have to know tomorrow. You know, it's a type of thing where you need to know these stem changes. So I've highlighted a handful of them, but realistically, almost everything on the chart you need to know fairly soon. And everything on that chart are verbs you already know. Let me point that out. So when those show up in the aorist, you're going to need to translate them accordingly, and they're going to look weird, and they're not going to go through the changes you would expect. Compound verbs with these stems will also go through these changes in the aorist. So like is erkoma will be is plus the stem change, plus that aelth stem change. And then finally, the second aorist is going to translate the same as the first aorist. When you parse this in a chart, it's just A for the tense. It's not like 2A or anything like this. It's just simply aorist. It's just that some verbs, when they're in the aorist, they look unusual. Okay? Let's talk about some examples, or just a brief example. So lipo is the verb I leave. In the imperfect, it's going to look like this. Elipon, elipez, elipen, elipomen, elipete, elipon. And you see, here's your normal stem for lipo. You have that historical augment on the front. You have the own on the back. So it's doing everything we would expect for an imperfect. So when it's in the aorist, the stem changes to leap. Sounds the same, but it's going to lose that epsilon. You see that? Everything else down the line is the same. So it's literally the presence of that epsilon. That's the difference between the imperfect and the aorist for this verb. That's it. Some of these stem changes will be really subtle. It'll be a single letter. Sometimes these stem changes will be a completely different thing. Like on this one, at least for leap, you can actually trace back to what that lexical form is. You know, it's not a far jump to go from elipo, or this elipone to lipo, because it at least sounds the same. That will definitely not be the case with all of your forms, for all your verbs. And let's look at some of the so let me stop here. Do you have any questions? Okay, move on. So here are the verbs that you guys know already through, or that you at the end of this week you will know. These are through chapter 11. You're going to notice that some of these, the ones in red, are the ones I said like you really need to know sooner rather than later. Some of these are very straightforward. For example, valo, and then the compound ekvalo will go to vol as the root. So you're going to lose a lambda there. Not so difficult, fairly straightforward, fairly close. Genoma, that gin, which is the stem here, that iota is going to that iota is going to translate, or going to swap to an epsilon. Again, not such a big change. It's fairly straightforward. Ionosko, that iota is going to drop out, and it's going to go to a gamma nu. So gno as the stem. So it just loses one of those vowels. And then we start to go weird. Erikomat is going to go to aelth. You see that? It's weird. It's annoying. This is that thing where I said, like, hey, if there's anything you don't never know what you might be looking at, it's probably erikomat, and this is why. And in the future, it's also like it's not even as straightforward as this. It goes to like le lutha or something. Like it's just le lusa. I don't know. It's ridiculous. Is the answer. Erikomat is just all over the place. And then moving on, lamvano, you're going to drop the mu, and it's just going to be lab as the stem. Most of these are fairly straightforward, is what I'm pointing out. There's a couple that are just off the charts. Lego goes to eep. It's another one you're not going to be able to track that. If you don't know it, you don't know it. Orao is going to go to id. Or Eid, sorry. There are also some other weird ones you need to pay attention to, like S-Theo is nothing like the stem is nothing like that. Echo is really nothing like it, the sigma key. Posco goes to Poth. Pino goes to P, so it just drops the new. That's not bad. But Pipto goes to Pes, which is weird. And then Pharaoh goes to Egneg, which is also odd. Like, there's just no way around it. So you can see, like, some of these, you'll be able to logic through. Like, I think that this is what I'm dealing with. Some of these, like, you're just off the charts. Like, you're like, I have no idea what it is unless you've memorized it. And there's just not an easy way around this, like, second era stem change stuff. Because, like, the stem change itself is how you're identifying you're in the arist itself. So how early on in my learning, how I would figure out that I'm dealing with an arist is that I would get to what I think should be the stem, and I'm like, I don't know that verb. Because I'd identify this as like, I'd get down to this P as my stem of what I'm looking at, and I'm like, PO. Yeah, that's not a verb I know. Like, I know my vocab, and that is not a word I know, so this is clearly a second aorist of something else. And so in a lot of these, I'd get to this, like, Negco, and I'd be like, nope, don't know that one. And so, like, that's new. And so, it's those types of things that would at least let me know that I'm in the arist, even if I can't figure out what the lexical form is. So at least I could parse it correctly in those instances, because I know I'm dealing with a second arist. But if I hadn't memorized the stem, I would just end up missing that lexical form. But at that, at least I get 7 of the 8 points at that point. I have a majority of what that parsing is worth, even if I'm going to miss a couple. Okay, so in light of that, do we feel okay with this era stuff? It's going to be tricky. It's going to be frustrating until you have it memorized. There's just not going to be an easy way around it.
For your recommendations for what we need to memorize in red there, are those available anywhere besides the PowerPoint?
Yeah, so if you go to Long's on 204,
okay.
Long actually has this identical chart, and he has asterisks near all of those stems. Cool. So I've literally just copied this chart out of Long's text.
Sure.
And for he offers a sorry, I'm sick right now, or I have a cold, and so I'm losing my voice. Also on 204 or 205, he walks through, like, the principal parts, trying to show you, like, what is weird in the third principal part, which is your arist, is also weird in the second principal part, which is the future. Let me point out, that chart is okay, but the more valuable chart to you all is actually in the appendix. I found this chart super helpful, which is on 583 in your textbook. And this chart shows you basically all the verbs for those second aorist verbs in every principal part. And so it shows you basically in the indicative everything and how it morphs and changes in all of the different principal parts. And it's a super helpful diagnostic tool as you're learning to kind of work with these verbs. Like, if you truly bump into something that you just don't know what you're looking at, this is going to help. So, for example, if you're looking down that chart, like if you look at echo, when you jump to the third principal part, which is your aorist, it's S cone, okay, for that first singular. But if you look at the future, it's XO, which looks nothing like. I mean, I guess it's actually, it looks somewhat like a. Yeah, I guess that actually makes sense. No, I take that back. That is a straightforward change, because what's happened is a sigma has encountered that key, and it's went to a C. So that's actually a normal change for the second principal part, which is your future. But if you go down to, like, Lego, for example, this is a good one. Lego in the third principal part, which is your aorist, is epone. But if you go to the second principal part, which is future, it's arrow, which is nothing like either of the other two. And this is what I'm talking about, is that occasionally your future tense, when you have a second aorist verb that goes weird, second aorist go weird in the aorist, those that go weird in the aorist will sometimes also go weird in the future. And this is what this chart kind of bears out as you kind of look through it. So this is a good, like, helpful thing moving towards the final is seeing how this verb changes in all the tenses. We don't have the fourth, fifth, or sixth principal parts yet. That's not something that we've learned yet, which are like the perfect and pluperfect and all that stuff, you know, or even like the sixth principal part is your aorist passive. So if you really want to know what an aorist passive looks like, it's that sixth principal part, and it's weird. Okay. So those are the charts that I would find helpful, that I would recommend. We learn our final form of EME this week, which is which hopefully should be encouraging, because this last form of EME is the most regular of all the EMEs. This future form of EME is these endings that we've seen over and over again: oma, te, ometha, esthe, onte. That should all look familiar, with an epsilon sigma in the front, and that's the future form. Like, if you'll remember, the future is just adding a sigma, and so what you end up having with this form of EME is the epsilon from the original EME with the sigma from the future tense. This is how I remembered it. Is I have an epsilon with a sigma. That sigma's from the future. That tells me on the future, and then the normal endings. So again, this EME is the most regular of the three EME forms we're going to learn this semester. So hopefully that's encouraging. It's fairly straightforward, all things considered. Okay, so I haven't went into genitive cases yet. Do you all want me to talk about that? You guys want me to take 10 minutes and walk through some of that with you? I can't hear anybody. Everybody's muted. Just everybody.
Are we going to have to know it, is what I asked.
Yes. Yeah. You will definitely need to know the genitive case structures. Okay, the case stuff. So is that a yes? You do want me to walk through it?
Yeah, more the merrier for me.
Okay. So what I'll say is this.
Well, maybe not merrier, but the more helpful for me.
So these two slides you are not required to know. Okay. So let me be very clear. The next two slides, if you want to tune out, viewers, if you guys are watching this later, you don't need the next two slides. So you could just mute me while I'm talking through these next two slides. But I find this information helpful for those of you who want to know the big picture of why the cases are the way they are. Okay. So in Western language, most Western languages are coming out of ancient Sanskrit. So that's like, if you go to the Indo-European stuff on page like 25, maybe, in like one of those early chapters. Let's see if I got that page number right. Indeed. When he talks about the Greek language, Indo-European language tree, page 25. Most of these are all coming out of Sanskrit. And so all of them are using are in some sense emerging out of this 8-case function of Sanskrit. Okay. And so in Sanskrit, you have, again, you're not responsible for any of this. This is all just to help you kind of frame what we are learning. The nominative is for naming. The nominative case is naming. The vocative is direct address. The genitive was used for to describe. So it's going to tell you about the type of something, the kind of something, or just general description. The ablative is is source or separation. Dative is for advantage or disadvantage, for the benefit of or for the interest of. The locative case was to talk about location. Instrumental was to talk about tools or devices or means, or all of those things sat in the instrumental, and the accusative was the direct object. Okay, fairly straightforward. So if you take those 8 cases and then you move into so here's to say 8 cases in Sanskrit. You go to Latin, the nominative, vocative, and genitive stay the same. The ablative absorbs the locative and instrumental. So this case has all of those functions baked into it. The dative and the accusative stay the same. You move into Greek, what happens is the nominative and the vocative stay the same. The genitive absorbs this ablative, which is that source or separation, in addition to description. And so this is why you can have something like a net of rope okay, which is describing how the net is made. And you can have also a net of fish, okay, which is a net that is containing, or it's separating the fish out. It's separate from, the fish are separate from the net, okay? So this whole idea of like containers and source and separation, all that is sitting in the ablative. The dative case is absorbing the locative and the instrumental cases in the Sanskrit. And so remember how I talked about 2x4 was the memory aid for the dative case for translating it? 2 maps to the locative because it's location. By maps to the instrumental by means of. And 4 maps to the dative for the benefit of, for the advantage of, stuff like that. So that 2x4 is actually a shorthand for also the kind of the large range of usages of that case itself. And the accusative is just your direct object. Okay, so that's the background for how cases and where they're coming from and why in Greek they are the way they are. And so when we talk about the genitive, so let's move to the next slide. So back in chapter 6, we learned that when the dative, just the raw dative, can be used, in addition to being an indirect object, it can be used to communicate means. Do you remember this? We're talking about like source and means and all that stuff. Just the raw dative was the means. That's because that dative case absorbed instrumentality. Because sitting in means is instrumentality in the dative case. So in the genitive, we're not only going to get the description of the type or kind of something, we're also going to be able to talk about in the genitive separation or sources of things. I am Tom of Kentucky. Jesus of Nazareth. So the genitive is going to carry not only a description, like describing what a thing is, or what it looks like, or, you know, so those other genitive modifiers, but it can also talk about like source separation, stuff like that. Containers, what it contains, what's inside of it, what's coming out of it, relationships between family members, stuff like that. Because like family members are a source, you know, like the father, you know, such and such of, you know, Joseph, Jesus of, you know, of Mary or whatever. Like this is, you know, because the source of Jesus is the Genesis is Mary, that type of thing. That familial relationship is carrying in it that ablative case of source. Okay. Wallace goes through all these. Oh, by the way, let me just say this briefly. If you go to Wallace has a great conversation about the difference between like the 5K structure versus the 8K structure, and which is that blue grammar book that you guys have picked up. In the intro, he has this conversation and this background that I'm giving you. But what's so fascinating about it is that even though he says like I'm going to use a 5K structure, and so like you go to like the dative chapter, and the dative chapter is divided into 3 sections: the dative, the locative, and the instrumental function of the dative case. So like even his structure of how he talks about this stuff is according to this 8K structure. And those are the subcategories of that. So if you can get that, even if you don't know the specific kind of dative we're dealing with, it can give you the idea of what the range of the dative is, what the range of the genitive is. And that's what I'm trying to do, is help us kind of sensitize us to that. Okay. Let's jump back forward again. Okay, so Wallace. So now we're going to go through a bunch of functions of the genitive. I'm going to move kind of quick because we're running, you know, like we're over time. But I do want, like, I want you all to know this as we're moving through these. You are responsible for these, but I'm not going to ask you to like identify how a genitive is being used in a translation. That's not how this is going to get deployed in 501. In intermediate, that's a fair game question. Okay, of like, okay, that's a genitive. How is that genitive being used?
I think that's more is on the quiz though. Look, because I did it yesterday and I missed. I got the subjective and the object mixed up.
So let me be very clear about this. You are tested over the definitions. Okay, so I may give you like a genitive. I can verify this, but I'm pretty sure that we don't have like raw translate. Like I don't give you any translations and then ask you to provide an interpretation of how a genitive is being used. You're saying on the new unit quiz there was a question like that?
I thought so. I thought it said there was a drop down, a list, and you matched them, and I thought it said, but maybe it was.
Yep.
Now I can't remember if it was in Greek or not. Maybe it was in English, but I thought we had. But I could be wrong. I just thought we had to read it and tell how the genitive was being used in this phrase. But that's okay. I thought, wait, I think I did that, but.
And that was on the new unit quiz?
Yeah, I think so.
Or the end.
So if I'm wrong, I apologize, but that just struck me because I thought, oh yeah, we had to do that.
So the type of thing you would have to do here, for example, is this. I could give you, let's go jump down a slide. I could give you this definition. The noun in the genitive case possesses or owns the noun that it modifies. And then there would be a drop-down menu, and you would have to pick which genitive that definition matches for. Like, that is fully fair game. Okay. But what I'm not going to give you is I'm not going to make you translate and then make you identify how a genitive is being used in that sentence. Okay. Do you see the difference between those types of assignments?
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. The phrases are in English.
Yeah.
For me, it was question number 4, but
let me. I will look into that. I don't want to mislead when I say that. You said it was question number 4, Susan?
Mm-hmm. It reminded me of the practice quizzes for the midterm. There were 3 phrases, and sometimes we had to tell the definition, and sometimes we had to translate it.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Yeah. What I would say is, like, yes. Yes. You're not going to have to do this with translation. You may have to, like, guess at, like, a function of how this is being used, like, in that type of thing. So, yes, there is some of this with English using examples.
Yeah.
Like some of these examples and stuff like that.
That's helpful.
Yes. Yep. So, like, let me articulate and be very clear. Yeah. But in general, what I'm looking for is making sure you know what these things are, is what I would say, and how they're functioning. But so don't freak out. Let me be clear about this. Don't freak out about definitions and making sure, like, every time you see a genitive, you're gonna have to identify those. That's not where we're going. Okay, that's more at an intermediate level. But we do want to make sure that you all are proficient in these functions. Okay. So the possessive genitive, it's going to be something like the noun in the genitive case, in this instance, toutheu, is possesses or own the noun that it modifies. So we might translate this as the church of God. But if you really feel strongly of, like, that this is a possessive, you might say, like, this is the church belonging to God. Does that make sense? The issue with this is that oftentimes these genitives there's going to be some degree of interpretive flexibility here, such that there may be multiple possibilities that are right. And so that's the challenge. When it helps when we've created an artificial scenario where, like, you can only use each answer once, and you, like, work through, which is what the type of question we offer on that new unit quiz, as opposed to just, like, giving you a genitive in a sentence and say, which one is it here, and not offer any other helps to kind of narrow down what the possibilities are. Because the reality is you could say, well, it's probably one of these 3. My guess is that, like, it could be A, B, or C. My guess is A. Because that's often where you're going to settle when you talk about the genitive usages. But this is going to be important when you get to exegesis. Because when you're exegeting a passage and you bump up to, like, a genitive modifier, you need to have a fairly good idea of what the range of that genitive is and what it is definitely not. And so that's why this is important, is, like, when you're actually doing your exegesis, to be able to work through and understand how that genitive modifier, what the range of kind of interpretive possibilities are. And I'll get to some stuff here in a minute with the subjective and objective that are definitely, like, things worthy of being fought over, is what I would say. So the attributive genitive is the noun in the genitive case is going to ascribe an attribute to the noun it modifies. So, for example, the movement is going to be the genitive modifier is going to modify this noun. Do you see that? And so it's going to be, so this is going to be some type of description of this, which is kind of how we've come to expect. Genitive modifiers are like genitive, like, or descriptions of that thing. And so this would be like, you might translate this as the body of sin, because it's just the body, you know, tosoma, tes amartias, the body of sin. But if you really, you know, like, if you're like, yeah, that's definitely an attribute genitive, you know, it is appropriate to translate it as characterized by. Okay. There's the attributed genitive, which we're going to get to later. It's the direction goes the opposite way, and that means, what that means is that the head noun, the one that's being modified by the genitive, is actually describing some characteristic or trait of the genitive. So the direction is actually the opposite, and we'll get to that here in a minute. What you're going to notice is a lot of these genitives are paired off. So there's like the subjective, objective, the attributive, attributed, and those are generally opposites. Like if there's a direction, an arrow of direction, the arrow is going to go the opposite direction. Okay. So let's do the subjective and objective genitive. You could read the descriptions here, but I found that it's sometimes easier to do something this way. Okay, so if you look down in the footnotes here, I have, it's not letting me change my font size, boo. Okay, anyways, so let's say I have this phrase, love of God. Okay, so in this phrase, love of God, I have a noun, love, and this noun has a verbal idea inherent in that noun. Okay, love has some type of verbal idea associated with it. Do we see that? So when you have this verbal idea, and then you have a genitive modifier, okay, you have a genitive modifier, so you have another noun, it follows, it's genitive modifier. Good? So now, the question is, so, you know, I could really create a scenario where I could say something like, I have a love of God. Okay. Versus, we are moved by the love of God. In this first instance, who is doing this noun that is a verbal idea?
We are.
Or like in I am, this first one, I have a love of God. So I am doing the loving. And what am I loving? What is the object of this verbal idea? In the first sentence.
God.
God. So God is the object of that love. Okay. Now let's look at the second one. We are moved by the love of God. This love, who is probably doing that love?
Divine presence.
Yeah, God. God is doing the love. That verbal idea is being done by God. It's God's love. Might be another way to say it. We are moved by God's love. Okay? So God then is the subject of this verbal idea rather than the object. Thus, this first one is can we guess? This is an objective genitive. Because God is the object of the verbal idea that's in the head noun, as opposed to the subject.
Oh, okay.
Because God is the one being, or the God is the one doing the love in the second example. Okay. So in light of that, let me do a brief excursus and talk about pistis. Have we talked about this before? We've learned this word. This one right. Where's my J? Where's my final form S? There it is. We talked about pistis before. Faith or faithfulness. Do we know that word? I forget. Anyways, faith or faithfulness, it has this verbal idea associated with it. Faith or faithfulness, to theou, of God. To theou. Faith or faithfulness of God. This is the heart of the debate between like Piper and Keller and NT Wright. And a lot of the new perspective stuff is, so is this an objective or a subjective genitive? Said another way, is the righteous saved by faith, the faith of God, the righteous saved by the faith of God? Is it the righteous's faith that they're saved by? Are you saved by your own faith? Or is it by the faithfulness of God, which would be a subjective? Is it the faithfulness of God that does the saving, rather than by the righteous's faith itself? This is messy because Paul seems to be playing with this possibility in Romans of like this kind of double entendre. Like he's kind of playing with both possibilities. If you go to the Habakkuk quote of what he's quoting, in Greek, it's likewise ambiguous in the Septuagint. You go back to the Hebrew, it's very clear that this is a subjective genitive. It's God's faithfulness that's doing the saving for the righteous, not the righteous's faith or their own faithfulness. So Luther, he takes a real hard, Luther and then the Reformed theologians after him take a real hard, it's the faithfulness or the faith of the righteous that's saving them. Obviously empowered by the Spirit and all that, but that delivery is happening on their end rather than on the faithfulness of God. So when N.T. Wright publishes his most recent mega volume, Paul in the Faithfulness of God, Wright was throwing down a gauntlet and saying, no, this is definitely a subjective genitive, and it's God's faithfulness that is how people are delivered. So even when that title got announced, people lost their minds because they knew where Wright was going to come down on this. But all that huge debate is about, is this an objective or a subjective genitive? That's the heart of that conversation. So
it's okay if we miss that question then.
What I would say is this. There are many folks, even in, I would categorize as like intermediate and advanced Greek, that will often mix up objective or subjective genitives. And which is which? Let me say that. I'm not saying that like when you're looking at something, is something an objective or subjective? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like, how do you define what a subjective is versus an objective? Like they don't do well in nuancing the difference between the two. Now, that said, in a particular context, it may be ambiguous whether something is an objective versus subjective genitive. And there is certainly some flex in that. Okay, I don't want to get bogged down too much in this, but it's something that has like very contemporary relevance for how like theologians are talking about certain things right now, which is why it's worth mentioning on the side. Okay. So the attributed genitive. So before, if you remember the attributed goes the other direction. So the attributive, the genitive is going to describe something about the head noun. Okay. So the sin is telling you something about the body. that the body, namely, it's describing some characteristic of the body, namely that the body is sinful. The body characterized by sin, the body of sin. So in the attributed genitive, the head noun is actually telling you something about the genitive noun that follows. So the head noun is genuineness, and the genitive modifier, this genitive is the attributed genitive, and that's, we're talking about the genuineness of this genitive, the genuineness of faith. So in a sense, like, the descriptive arrow is going the other direction now from the attributive genitive. The genitive direct object we've talked about already. The genitive direct object, some verbs will take genitive direct objects. These are verbs of sensation, emotion, volition, sharing, ruling. There's a whole list of verbs that do this. Wallace talks about that if you're really interested in tracking that down right now. Again, this is more of intermediate level stuff. I'm just making sure that you're familiar with it. We've seen an example of this already. Akuo, for example. Akuo takes a genitive direct object. This is a function of that source. Remember how we talked about the genitive takes the ablative, which is source? You hear from something. You hear from the source of something. So the genitive, so those verbal ideas that need a source of that sensory input, that they're going to take a genitive, because the genitive is a source in those instances. So that's that ablative function coming through in the genitive case. The partitive genitive, it's going to occur when one member of a small group is identified as belonging to a larger group, which is indicated by a genitive noun. So in this example, we have one of the teachers. So the genitive is the larger group. Is is the one part of that larger group. Long adds this phrase, who is a member or who is a member of. You could just as easily translate this one of the teachers and still have that kind of sense come through. That this is a partitive. It's a small part of a larger group, the genitive being the larger group. The genitive is going to use after comparative adjectival constructions. Don't worry about that. We'll cover it in chapter 25. You'll see that trotted out there. And then finally, the appositional genitive. I don't like this example, but it's the one that Long uses. It typically states a specific example that is part of a larger category named by the head noun. And so in this instance, Long is making the argument that the advanced payment or the down payment is the larger category, and that the spirit is one portion of that down payment that we're experiencing. I would disagree. I would argue that, like, if I were doing this, I would say that arguably what this is a descriptive genitive, and that this is telling the down payment of the spirit is telling you something about what the down payment is. So it's describing what the down payment is rather than being a portion of the larger whole. But I could maybe see theologically where he gets there if he's saying that like gifts and fruit and all those other things are wrapped up in this advance payment thing, the arabona, sorry. And then finally, genitive content. This is that source. This is that ablative function. So the genitive can get translated as full of or containing. So you have here a net full of fish. This is not describing how the net is made or the composition of the net. It is not a net made out of fish. Instead, is a net that is filled with fish. A bucket of water or a bucket of ice is indeed not an ice bucket, but it is a bucket that is full of ice. Okay, those are your genitives. Brief questions before we wrap up. Some of these examples are better than others, is what I would say. But you will often find that there will be some degree of conversation about these, even in intermediate and advanced Greek. Most often what you would hear somebody say is that we have a genitive here modifying this other noun. It's either an X or a Y, but I'm guessing it's probably an X in this context. You know, that's the type of the type of way that this gets deployed, kind of down the road. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have any questions before we wrap up? I'm going to assume that we have a pretty good grasp of this, and everybody's going to do really well. Okay. Well, you all know my email. Let me, as a brief aside, for those of you that are sending me emails or trying to send me emails and they're not getting to me, I'm not ignoring your email, I promise. Just make sure that you're addressing it to the email address that's on the syllabus, which is thomas.m.lyons. There's indeed another student that goes to the seminary whose email is thomas.lyons. That is not me. If you send an email to that individual, they may or may not forward them to me. They forwarded a whole bunch of emails. I have not gotten all of them. So,
Wow.
yes, I apparently have a popular name. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I hope that's, and if you have any other questions, obviously contact me and we will resolve those. So blessings on all of you this evening and all of you watching at home.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.